Welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian Hobbs, managing editor for Being Libertarian, LLC. You know our websites, you know our podcasts, you know you can follow me directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And without further ado, let's get the show on the road. I'm joined today by Amos Joseph. Amos, if you don't recall, he is the host of the podcast 10K Rum. He's joined me today to discuss absurdism. Amos, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Let's just hope this doesn't become the most absurd episode you've done.
Wah, wah. I think if that's the kind of bar that we're setting for humor, I think it's going to win as the most absurd episode. If that's where we're setting our level for joke telling,
we're going to reach levels of absurd not possible.
You know, the punster in me really wants to follow up on that one, but I let's move on. Let's just move on at a rapid pace. It is kind of nice though to actually have to have this flipped though, because it was can't even remember when. It was quite a while ago, I think now, that I was actually a guest on your podcast. You and Brooke Potter hosting 10K Rum there, but that was
back when it was a different name. So
yeah, I was back under a different name, so that was quite some time ago, but still glad to have you on today. So for those of you that don't know, absurdism is, it can be filed under general existentialist philosophy. So when it comes to existentialism, there's different answers to the concept of the meaning of life or why we're here or these other types of metaphysical questions. Now, some people, you know, they find God. Some people, they believe that there's certain, say, biological reasons for us being here or just certain natural orders that we are to follow. Obviously, Friedrich Nietzsche had nihilism, in which case he rejected any kind of solid beliefs into these things. However, a different philosopher by the name of Albert Camus came up with a slightly different idea. His idea was something known as the absurd. The absurd is the conflict that happens between human beings' desire to find meaning and purpose in life versus the universe effectively being chaotic. The chaos in and of itself is an absurd. The seeking of meaning in and of itself is an absurd, but it's the seeking of meaning inside an inherently chaotic universe that becomes the absurd. Absurdism tries to explore the different ways of how to exist with that knowledge. Amos, maybe you can dive into it a little bit better here and kind of explain the type of question that absurdism is supposed to answer and the kind of conclusion that it reaches.
I mean, it is more puns going into this now. It is pretty absurd to try to tackle that. Is kind of what Camus is kind of touches on, is he's looking at existence instead of being sort of intrinsically meaningless like nihilism. He looks at it as, you know, the examining the relationship between sort of the absurdity of existing and living and the fact that we put meaning into it. And he examines the three different ways that we sort of tackle this absurdity. And I've looked at, you know, and I personally have even like examined the three and if you want to say experience the three types of different ways of thinking. You have religion. So, you know, my past as a former preacher, like religion is like a way of sort of explaining the absurdity, sort of organizing it in a way that is easily, well, manageable, where you can basically kind of live and not be constantly bombarded with like just how pointless things can seem, how absurd things can seem. And then there's the aspect of of suicide that Camus looks at, where he also looks at it as seeing like, well, yeah, you can sort of allow the absurdity to kind of cause you to feel like it's just pointless. So you might as well end your life. And he says, well, that's not a really good answer either. And then there's the third case of sort of embracing the absurd, sort of finding your own meaning, but not actually like fully taking on the fact that like there's a sort of ambiguity, I guess, in it, where you realize that, there is an absurdity in existing, but you don't let it like take over. But you're also not trying to explain it away with some sort of, and this is no offense to any religious people, but not to sort of explain it away with theology or mythology.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just to go into the history a little bit here, it's worth noting that some of these ideas, they were best defined through Albert Camus' work. However, they didn't necessarily originate with him. There was a long and rich history of existential philosophy all throughout the ages. Probably the closest work to Albert Camus would have been Søren Kierkegaard. He came to similar conclusions, but Camus really stepped out and away in his attempts to just straight on counter nihilism, especially considering the timeline that this ideology, these writings came out. So Albert Camus wrote his main essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, as well as his later refutation of nihilism, The Rebel, which are probably his two most well-known works. He wrote these during the time of World War II, just as things were starting to finally slow down. But again, this was France, World War II era. His country was not having a good time, to say the least. So I think that aspect too is very interesting when we look at his preferred solution of the three. He didn't favor the religious aspect. He definitely didn't favor suicide. I believe, I forget the exact quote, but his view on suicide was effectively that if you end your own existence in a way of countering the need of meaning in it, you're actually just expounding on the absurd and making it even more so, rather than actually solving anything.
Right.
Which then just leads to, we could almost call the position of spite. Like it's what I like. It's what I like. It's with this philosophy is everything is absurd, and you should continue to try to find meaning in it anyway. Just kind of living in spite of the existence of the absurd.
Right. I mean, you look at a lot of the quotes from Camus, and you see a lot of common theme of sort of being. There's a sort of like a being present in the moment. Like a lot of his direction, like what it kind of the advice he gives to people is just kind of, don't try so hard, but don't be completely careless, but just be in the moment. And he really just talks a lot about and there's a lot of spite, of course, a lot of sort of this constant sort of struggle to live, not as a struggle like you're a victim, but more as a struggle like make this meaning that you're trying to pursue actually worthwhile. Like put your heart and soul into it. He says to live life to the point of tears. He's like, actually make the most of this meaning that you're trying to find or create in your own life. It was very kind of just in spite of everything, live your life, which is what really attracted me to that line of thinking.
Yeah, one thing that I really found interesting, if we're talking about Albert Camus quotes here, and again, I wish I marked down the specific quote here. There isn't really one specific quote for it. It's an entire just part of his passages. When he talks about the rejection of hope, this is something that I found was exceedingly interesting when it came to his view on how to deal with the absurd. In essence, Camus says that you need to get rid of hope. Hope has nothing to do with despair or with sadness or with anguish or anything like that, but rather that having a form of hope means that you believe that there's going to be something more than the absurd that is our existence. So to have hope be like for something beyond what is the absurd just actually increases how absurd your existence is. So by rejecting it, you can go ahead and fulfill that idea of living your life to the fullest. It's only when you hope that there's something more than the absurd that you end up actually binding yourself and limiting your life with that. I found that was a really interesting take on the concept of freedom itself when we're looking at this concept of a chaotic universe while we as human beings still try to find meaning to it.
I actually know what quote you're probably referring to that's pretty close.
Oh, by all means.
You will never be happy if you continue to search for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you're looking for the meaning of life. So it's an embracing of the absurd without trying to overcomplicate like what might be or what might not be beyond the absurd. Like the struggle to find meaning. Like finding meaning is one thing, whereas just making your own meaning is different. Like that, those two things are different, which he kind of brings out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do this because this means something to me. But if I'm doing this in order to find a meaning, then that's not what he was trying to go do.
Mm-hmm. Now, one example that he uses or leans a little bit heavily on, everyone knows the famous Camus quote, one must imagine Sisyphus is happy, when he talks about the repetitive toils. But a comparison that he makes that I find even more interesting than that particular one is his references to Don Juan. So for those that are unfamiliar with the story, Don Juan is basically a drinker of life. He partakes in anything and everything that tickles his fancy, whether it's countless women, whether it's the wine. Just he takes in as much of life as he can. One aspect as well that I find pretty interesting when it comes to the absurdist philosophy actually has to come to the idea of integrity. So in the writings, he talks about the character Don Juan. So for those of you that are unaware, Don Juan is a drinker of life. He's a person. He partakes in women. He partakes in drinks, parties. He does anything that tickles his fancy. And Albert Camus uses him as an example of what an absurdist life can look like. Now, in the original story of Don Juan, he eventually settles down on things, takes up vows, kind of just abandons the life that he was most famous for. Albert Camus sees that as a tragedy because he's giving up on who he is and trying to find something beyond the absurd when he was living perfectly in harmony with himself and the absurd during his Don Juan ways. What I find interesting is with that, he goes through a lot of the other aspects and stories of the key concepts that he's trying to capture here, such as, personal meaning, the just illusions of reality, the concepts of freedom, even the concepts of hope that we talked about a few seconds ago there. But it's really the integrity aspect that I find really interesting. In absurdist philosophy, you're not guided by morality. because morality is just not a thing. It's to hope for morality is to try to find some form of meaning, which of course absurdist philosophy rejects wholesale. This includes morality.
Right.
By default, an absurdist is amoral. And it should be noticed this is different from being immoral. Amoral is just, it's out and away. So it's not the negative side, it's the void side, if you will. But the focal point is on the concept of just integrity. So you're not concerned with what's right, with what's wrong. You don't spend 10,000 hours watching, like flipping through a whole bunch of different trolley problem memes or anything like that. You don't take those moral arguments and try to figure out what is right, but instead you act with an honesty about yourself, about what your motivations are, what your desires are, and you apply yourself consistently to reality. And I find there's obviously, for those of you that, for the majority of people that still hold moralistic views, it's possible, of course, to have an idea of something that is right, have an idea of something that is wrong, discuss the morality of certain actions or certain ideas. But in pure absurdist philosophy, it basically doesn't even treat those things as, just a subjective concept, but rather treats them as a non-existing concept. It's a thing people talk about to kind of decide or choose what their actions should be, whereas the absurdist philosophy is no, the actions you choose should be the actions you choose. They should be the ones that are coming from the self and are, again, consistently being applied as is your true nature. So I got a question, though, for you, Amos. Maybe this is something that you can elaborate on a little bit further. Other than just simply saying, well, that's not a thing, or some other kind of dismissive answer like that, how does an absurdist tackle moral issues? Or at least get involved in those conversations?
Well, there's definitely going to be a lot of honesty when it comes to conversations like that. You need to look at, by remaining amoral, I think the next step would be to look at sort of the reality of what is going on. I mean, for example, and this is obviously a very controversial topic, so I'm not going to take any stance on it just for the sake of discussing this. But, for example, abortion has a very like a wide variety of facets to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a lot of moral arguments thrown around about it. Whereas when you look at the reality, you have to look at a lot of different things. By banning abortion at a certain point, do you then open up the possibility for, botched abortions resulting in death, resulting in a health problem? Do you allow it to continue freely, and then you dabble? Now you cross into different types of political philosophies. Should the government be involved in it? Shouldn't the government be involved in it? Who can, who can't? You get into these things that go way beyond the moral argument. You get some more into the logistical problems, the political problems, the what this does to a society, things like that. Completely devoid of any real moral arguments at this point, and that's, I guess, how I aim. That would be the more practical side. I know that's not probably that's I guess how I see as myself as a someone who subscribes to absurdist thinking. That'd be the next step.
Okay, so effectively, to participate in the conversation or to work through the conversation, it would be to get the highlight away from the moral concepts of it, because there's so many practical concepts that need to be addressed first before you run off into those weeds, so to speak.
Right, because by by completely dismissing just how humans are, how people behave, and just throwing down this moral gauntlet, so to speak, you're not really considering all the factors. It just becomes, well, purely moral without any regard for anything else that could happen, any consequences.
Mm-hmm. And with a lot of them, and this isn't just strict to the abortion debate. This can be applied to literally every type of debate that there is out there.
Economic systems, political systems, ways of running government.
Exactly. It's the thing I find, especially when a lot of those start to boil down to the moralistic arguments, is that you end up where the facts or the ideas or other competing concepts, the data, everything else, it ends up getting picked at. So I find that once you have moralistic arguments involved in a conversation, or if there's any kind of morality that's being applied to an argument, or at least is I guess you could say the guiding hand behind someone making an argument, I find that at that point, that's when you start to see people cherry pick data. You don't usually see people bothering to cherry pick information about things that they have no particular moral stance on. Like, most people don't have a moral stance when it comes to, let's say, chemistry in general, right? So when people are doing experiments with it or developing new chemicals, different things like that, there isn't any kind of moralistic argument with it. So there's no, cherry picking of it. Like, you do get into moralistic arguments once you get into like biochemistry or, bio anything, just because as soon as you're involving life forms, morality pops its head up, of course. But I find that morality can really be a cloud sometimes in these discussions. Now, that's not to say that morality is completely without purpose. I myself am not an absurdist. I do think that if for no reason other than the fact that we've all organized and instilled each other in our own behaviors and our own thought processes, the concepts of morality, even if it's just basebone practicality of how to make a group of people function without killing each other, it still needs to be taken into account. But I like the absurdist approach of pushing that aside and maybe coming to it later or coming to it more at a leisure. It does lead me to an interesting question here, though. Considering some of the absurdist standpoints, like its stance on freedom, which is, that you can't really achieve freedom beyond what the existence of what the absurdity of existence permits. Its view on integrity versus morality, different things like that. I'll leave you with two questions here, actually, Amos. The first question would be, what kind of political system would be most in line with absurdism? And the second would be that if existence itself is to be considered absurd and without meaning and everything else, then how can an absurdist necessarily support a specific political stance?
Boy, that's
hitting you with the heavy ones here.
Before I get into that, actually, I was while we were talking about the moral being, amoral. One thing I find very interesting is when the moral arguments pop their head into so many different topics. It bring you have emotion that gets you basically invoke emotion into the argument. People start saying, you don't care about this, you don't care about that, I care about this, and whatever. completely dismissing the broader picture, like you said, the cherry picking of data.
Mm-hmm.
But in that emotion, I think that emotion is not just, I wonder if that emotion is not just sort of the passion for the morals someone is arguing for, but also sort of by questioning that moral, you're almost questioning that dissonance that they have in their moral arguments. So if, again, back to the abortion thing, if they say, well, pro-life because, I don't want to kill babies. Okay. So by putting a complete and total ban on abortion, do you then not care about the possible deaths of mothers that want to get abortions and gets botched? And then you start invoking more emotions and they say, no, you don't get it because this, and then you have that dissonance, which really comes down to, I think, the bigger picture of trying to sort of, and you said the cloud sort of brings a cloud over the argument, over the problem. I cannot help but think of the meme based off The Simpsons, old man yelling at cloud.
Yep.
That's, I think, kind of what the moral arguments kind of bring into it is we're more yelling at the cloud than yelling at the problem. Or sort of that dissonance you're having by confronting like, hey, your morals are clouding your judgment with the bigger picture. It is a dissonance to realizing that morals don't matter as much sometimes. Certain morals are going to cloud your how you look at things, and you're not going to be honest. You're not going to be, you're sort of, by trying to fight the absurd,
Mm-hmm.
you're dismissing everything else.
Well, which actually kind of loops back. To our the question I laid out for you there. Actually,
yes.
So I'll kind of reframe it here actually, because I could probably just put it out as one question because I think it'll kind of explain itself as we go through it. When we're talking about lifting and removing that cloud, right? Or we're trying to find, we're seeing life as this absurd thing. How can we then have, a set of, like, how do we develop those set of guiding principles, those set of things that make us say, okay, this is the right thing to do? Like, how do we establish what is the right thing to do, which is a core component of developing a political ideology or a political philosophy? How do we reach that decision if the absurdist stance is to effectively push that aside entirely?
I would see whatever is to promote, I guess, what Camus was, when he looked at the three different solutions, whatever allows people to really, I guess, embrace and live in spite of the absurd. What allows people to explore and find personal meaning without putting on any sort of moral principles, any forcing anyone to live a certain life. So bringing it back to the when you had the two questions, probably some form of a libertarian ideal would allow people to basically work out their own meaning in life. They're not really forcing anything on. There's no need. There's no real strong moral, pushes for people to live one way or another. It allows people to make their own decisions. Yeah.
Okay. So you'd say then that absurdism best fits then with libertarianism because libertarianism removes the man-made boundaries between people in their own existence.
it allows people to be as free or as not free as they want to be of their own free will. They get to explore the absurdity. They get to explore that freely without the need of having to, abide by certain morals. Because, again, back to the abortion topic, you have a lot of moral judgments on many sides. Whereas if you just remove all of that in terms of the political side, people are free to explore and find their own meaning.
So one last question I'll leave you with here, and it's the same question I ask any guest when I have them on to talk about a particular idea or a particular person. We spent a good chunk of the episode mainly talking about Albert Camus, but the work of Soren Kierkegaard, like I said, was very foundational in a lot of the development here. There's definitely been other writers and other people since Camus that is definitely worth looking into as well. But the last question I'll leave you with here is, when it comes to absurdist philosophy, what would you say, or is there any aspects to it that you would find that you disagree with?
What I would disagree with absurdism is, I guess, how absurd Camus sort of sees life as. So, with my past of being a minister and having that religious, having a good few years of the religious experience, I'm basically I would consider myself an agnostic when it comes to religiously. So I would see life, I do see the absurdity, but I still prescribe some, I guess, order, if you want to say, to life in general, to existence, while still understanding that, embracing the fact that when I look at it objectively, it is pretty absurd. That there are aspects of it that if I look at it through a certain lens, I can see that, yeah, there's a lot of things that can seem very absurd. A lot of things that can seem pretty pointless almost, So I've, explored the different, I guess, along the spectrum of existentialism. I have, for a time, dabbled in thinking more nihilistically, and then moving, kind of nudging towards a more absurdist view. But it's not, I don't see it as absurd as maybe a more pure type of absurdist might.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting, though. So we're going to wrap everything up here. Ellis, thanks again for coming on tonight. We've been trying a little back and forth to get this organized. I think it's been a few weeks of back and forth trying to make sure that our schedules actually lined up. But no, it was a pleasure having you on. For those of you that haven't, definitely go check out the 10K Rum podcast. I'm pretty sure you can get it practically anywhere that you get podcasts. So definitely make sure to go give that a listen. Keep an eye out, of course, for all the other podcasts that are available on the Think Liberty Network, of course, Think Liberty Podcast Network. You can follow me directly on Facebook just by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And for those of you that are looking to, in some way, shape, or form, support the show and help us out with all of the work and content that we bring to you every week, we do have a Patreon that is available in the show notes. If you just take a look at those after you're done listening, of course. So with all that said, as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.